ensuring the success of any sort of development projects, whether it's related to health, poverty reduction, environment, and all of this, because journalists play this really important fundamental intermediary role. And they are really at the forefront of reporting and holding government officials and other authorities accountable. And we can see that they're facing around the world extreme threats. So the past 4 years have been some of the most dangerous on record, with record numbers of journalists killed and imprisoned. And what we do at CPJ is we look at each case of a journalist who was killed. What was their beat? What were they reporting on when they were killed? And we are talking about murders and killings while journalists were doing journalism or because of their journalism. And what we see is that of the 30 journalists killed this year so far, 23% of them were covering corruption. And this is the same since we started keeping records in 1992. About 20% of journalists have been on the corruption beat, which makes it one of the most dangerous at the same level as, for example, covering war. And perhaps shockingly, some of the worst countries for these types of murders are democracies, where you should have some accountability, such as the Philippines, Brazil, and Colombia topping the list of places where journalists who have been covering corruption have been killed. Unfortunately, we see that it's pretty equal opportunity around the world. And I want to just share a couple of specific stories where, journalists, I'm sure many of you heard about the Panama Papers. A lot in that investigative journalism collaborative was around taxes and around tax evasion and what is happening with all of this money being funneled into a lot of these countries that are World Bank recipients. Well, many of the journalists who were involved in the Panama Papers are among the leading investigative journalists in their countries, and several of them have been imprisoned or retaliated against, either before, during, or after the Panama Papers. One of these is Hadija Ismailova, who was imprisoned in Azerbaijan for reporting on the tax situation of the ruling family there. Similarly in China. And there are two cases that are really upsetting that I wanted to mention. One is the case of a journalist in, sorry, let me grab my notes, of Joseph Titi, who published Aujourd'hui and was detained in prison in the Ivory Coast. He had been the publisher of a paper that was reporting on money laundering and illicit funds transfers, embezzlement of funds related to World Bank and IMF projects. This seems like it would be right up the alley of what the World Bank would want to know about. But he was imprisoned, he was charged with defamation, insulting the president and foreign head of state, and publishing false information. And we haven't seen any response from the bank. Similarly, there was a case of a journalist in Ethiopia, well, not a journalist, more of a fixer, a media worker, helping with translation and fixing for a reporter from the International Center for International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, who was looking into what was happening with displacement of people from World Bank projects. So looking at specific World Bank policies. They have policies against displacement. And so they did this big investigative journalism project, and he was helping out. And shortly thereafter, he was arrested and put in prison on terrorism charges. So basically, reporting on displacement was equated with terrorism. This is deeply problematic because the World Bank, he had also actually helped out the World Bank in doing some work on the ground, and the World Bank, according to the ICIJ journalist I spoke with, never said anything about it. And in fact, when ICIJ went to the World Bank with its reporting to get its response to this story, the World Bank, it was discovered, had secretly analyzed this and had their own reports showing the same conclusions, and attempted to preempt the investigation by releasing a new platform and talking about policy revisions, et cetera, related to that. So these two stories show not only the impact that investigative journalism has in terms of bringing about policy changes that can improve the lives of people on the ground, but really the closing space and the challenges that journalists face in reporting across a myriad of issues that directly touch on World Bank and IMF priorities.